Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening to talk about special education services. We're going to hold off for just a minute to give people time to get logged in. So get situated, sit tight, and we're going to share some really hopefully helpful information. As people are joining us, I want to let you all know that because of the size of the audience, we have your microphones and your videos muted. I'm so sorry about that, but you can actually type questions in the Q&A box. So please do that. If you have questions, we want to make sure we're answering them throughout. So please participate by typing in the Q&A. I'm going to hold off for just another minute as people put away their dinner dishes and join us, or they're getting situated in their car, depending on where you are, East Coast, West Coast, middle of the country. If there's any way you could like get Jack to run somewhere else, I don't know. Okay. Thanks everyone for joining us this evening. I'm Judith Ursitti. I'm Director of State Government Affairs at Autism Speaks. I'm also a proud mom of Jack Ursitti, who is 17, and he is diagnosed with autism and a severe intellectual disability. And he's actually running up and down the hallway. So you might see some Jack appearances this evening. So I apologize in advance for any background noise. As you know, that's our life. I want to reacquaint you with Autism Speaks mission if you're not familiar. We definitely are committed to research, to advocacy, to understanding and acceptance. And we want to make sure that we're advocating across the spectrum for people of all ages who need various solutions. We have a diverse population and everyone matters, and we're dedicated to that. And that's one of the reasons we're talking with you this evening. I also want to let you know that I'm not a doctor. I'm not giving you medical advice, or we're not giving you legal advice tonight. So please sit back, ask questions, interact with us, but know that we're just trying to share helpful information with our community tonight. Okay, I talked about how Autism Speaks is committed to research, awareness, acceptance. The presenters tonight, for the most part, are all about advocacy with a touch of supports and services at the end too. We're definitely committed to advocating with local officials, federal officials, state officials, nationwide. During COVID-19, it's been really interesting and challenging, I know, for all of you to try to pivot and to adjust to this new way of life in our community. We've had to pivot too with our advocacy priorities, and we've been working very hard on the state level and on the federal level to make sure that there's funding to support schools and to support our students as they attempt to access special education. And we want to make sure that if the opportunity is appropriate, if it's safe and equitable, that students who need in-person services can access them at school. We want to make sure that people in our community are protected from the spread of COVID. And we want to make sure that people who need accommodations, for instance, those who might struggle with wearing a mask, that they are appropriately supported in the community. These are just some of the priorities we have during COVID-19. You can find those on our website. We also have just a general public policy page where we talk about what we're working on behalf of our community. And there's a link to that. You will be provided this presentation in a PDF form, and also there will be a recording of it that you can watch. So as you look through the slides with us tonight, just know if you see a link, you're going to be able to click through if you want to get additional information. Okay, so we have so much information to share. We're excited to be able to connect with our community tonight and talk about the challenges of special education. Over these last several months now, I want to say a few months, but it's been a long time. It's been a long time. We've been hearing from the community in our state advocacy calls and our federal advocacy ambassador calls, and also our autism response team. They receive emails, chats, phone calls from our community. And so we really wanted to try to address the top 5 questions we're hearing tonight from our community through those channels regarding special education. It's a challenging, confusing time. So Bart, Devon, who's from our federal Autism Speaks team, Christa Stevens, who's also Director of State Government Affairs at Autism Speaks, are going to share really helpful information with you tonight. And then please sit tight, stay tuned till the end, get some popcorn, put on your sweatpants and enjoy, because we're going to share information and resources that Autism Speaks has for you. And Andrew Nelson and Arianna Esposito are going to share those for you. And again, I remind you, you're muted. I'm so sorry about that, but please do interact with the Q&A box. We want to hear from you. So let's talk about that. What are those top 5 questions? I bet many of you already kind of have an idea and have been thinking about these things. The first one is, what happens with FAPE during COVID-19? So for those of you who don't know what FAPE is the acronym for a free and appropriate public education that's required under the Federal Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. We call it FAPE, but if you really want to know what it stands for, it's a free and appropriate public education. We're going to talk about homeschool versus homebound, the timing of IEP meetings and evaluations. How does that work during COVID? What in the world is the difference between remote and virtual learning? And then finally, compensatory services. You're hearing so much about that, I'm sure. What are they? How do you get them? How does that work? So let's start off with our first question. How does FAPE work during COVID-19? And with that, I'm going to turn to Bart Devon, who is going to share with you. Take it away, Bart.
Thank you so much, Judith, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining the call. I'm going to guess that many, if not most of the people on this call know what FAPE is. Thank you, Judith, for spelling it out for us. But I think it's worth saying again because it is such a core concept in special ed. So FAPE is, it's arguably the heart and soul of IDEA. So IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, we don't usually call it IDEA, requires that public schools provide to qualified students with disabilities a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment, which is by default general ed classroom alongside non-disabled students. This is a fundamental right for students with disabilities, and again, it's a fundamental concept in special ed. One term that is not on the slide, but I want to make sure that I spell out for you, is IEP, the Individualized Education Program, or Individualized Education Plan, same thing. So this is probably the most used acronym in special ed. What it is the document that communicates the goals and the process, what they are for each student who receives services under IDEA, the IEP. Okay. And also, as a side note, I want to make sure to mention that, as Judith said, the Autism Speaks advocacy team has been working hard throughout the pandemic in Washington and across the country to make sure that the legal protections around IDEA don't erode. These are difficult times like these are always the times when rights are the most vulnerable to change that might prove to be negative in the long run. So does IDEA apply to all schools? So I'm also guessing that many, if not most of the people on this call are parents, and that you have kids who are enrolled at your local public schools. It's something like, I think it's 92%, it's 90 some odd percent of all the K-12 students in this country are enrolled in their local public schools. So that is the primary setting for special education. So as a general rule, oh, sorry, could you go back please, Judith?
Sure.
Thank you. So as a general rule, IDEA does not apply to schools that don't receive federal funds, such as private schools. This is sort of the rule. So remember, FAPE is a free, appropriate public education. And the mechanism that the government uses to make sure that schools provide FAPE is by making it a string attached to federal dollars. So if schools elect not to receive federal dollars, they don't have the legal obligation to provide a FAPE. Next slide, please. I will note that IDEA does contain provisions for students who, for whatever reason, need to be in school somewhere besides their local public school. But those private placements are a whole topic unto themselves, and they're a little outside the scope of this webinar. But if you have questions about private placement for your child, I encourage you to contact our art team, and we'll give you the contact information a little later. So how has COVID-19 changed IDEA? The short answer is that it hasn't, right? IDEA is a federal law, and it can only be changed by an act of Congress. So in other words, they'd have to pass a law to change it, and they haven't done that. Congress has not amended IDEA since 2004, believe it or not, including now during the pandemic. So therefore, all IDEA rights, including FAPE, are intact and unchanged. So how can that be true when everything is so different right now? At Autism Speaks, we know that things are different for everyone. First and foremost, for the young people that we're all here for. But also for teachers and families and even advocates like us. It just is a different world now, and we know that it's been difficult for people. So how can we reconcile everything that's going on with schools, in different parts of the country, with the fact that the law hasn't changed? I think that the disconnect here is an example of the difference between the policy and the implementation. So again, the law hasn't changed, just the way that it's being carried out day to day. I think the most timely example of this is actually the right to vote, right? So the right to vote itself has not changed before. It hasn't changed. So before the pandemic, usually that would mean you would, go to your local high school or your community center, your polling place, and just vote in person. You cast your ballot in person. But now, because of the pandemic, maybe that isn't safe. And so many people are voting by mail, which they might not have done before. So again, the right to vote is the same. It's just the way you do it might be different. And so, the main reason that implementation is different from place to place is because the way that it's carried out isn't set by the federal government, it's set by state governments. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Christa to provide some insight into what the different states are doing.
Actually, Bart, it's Judith.
Oh, it's Judith. Sorry. My apologies.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Christa and I are tag teaming on the states. So I'm going to give you just a couple of examples of what the state education departments are saying about that free and appropriate public education. First example is from the Oklahoma Department of Education. This is from the website, and we actually have been working with Oklahoma stakeholders and their director of special education throughout COVID And they are very clear on their website that IDEA is intact, that FAPE is intact, and it is expected. So that's just an example for you. If you're sitting in California or Oregon or Louisiana and say, well, Oklahoma doesn't have anything to do with me, just an example. And you can certainly go to your state's special education website or education website or the State Board of Education website. You can look through all those, and they have specific information for families that I encourage you to read. Just another example to give you, this is from Illinois, just up the road. They take it a little bit further. They talk about accessing a free and appropriate public education. And they also reiterate that if things aren't going well, if you feel like your child is not receiving FAPE, during this time. And keep in mind that, you know, when school is in session, whether it's remotely or not, if they're in session for any student for, you know, a minute, that means that FAPE is intact and it should be provided. So there will be differences, as Bart talked about. It might look a little different, just like voting looks a little different right now. Going out, you know, looks a little bit different right now, but FAPE is still intact, and you have every right to advocate for that if you feel like your child is not receiving it. In Illinois, they reiterate that you can have an IEP facilitation, you can file a written state complaint, request mediation, or a due process hearing. Those are not fun, but they're necessary many times. And so please know that those avenues are open and available to you if needed during COVID. All right, so moving right ahead, that was your FAPE foundation. Now we're going to talk about what is the difference between homeschooled and homebound. We're hearing that terminology more and more. So Bart, back to you.
Okay, so what is the difference between homebound instruction versus homeschooling? So young people are at home. It was true in the spring, and for most of the country, it's true now. So as Judith said, so naturally we've been getting a lot of calls from people asking us whether their kids are being homeschooled or they're homebound or what, or at least showing us that people don't really know what the difference is. So part of the confusion here, I think, is the fact that homebound instruction is not defined in federal law, so it will vary from state to state. But the basic gist of it is that homebound instruction consists of resources and a curriculum provided by and through the public school, you know, when a student is unable to attend in person due to some kind of medical fragility, as documented by a physician, and probably for a limited amount of time. So there's no change to the student's enrollment. An example of this would be, you know, if a student is recovering from major surgery. So let's say, you know, the student's going to be out for 2 weeks. It might turn out to be 3, but the idea is that that student will now be homebound, and the school will provide resources to the family so that that student won't fall behind. Now, homeschooling is a little bit different. It's similar in that it's also not defined in federal law, and so it will also vary from state to state. But the gist of it, next bullet, please. The basic gist of it is that it's an alternative method of education. So it's where a parent or a caregiver chooses to instruct that youth at home indefinitely, separate and apart from the public school, but in line with what the state requires of it. So you can think of this in sort of the same vein as a public school or a private school or a parochial school or a charter school, a homeschool. It's just a different way of educating altogether. So the question we get really is, you know, which one is my son or daughter in? Which one is Zoom school? And the answer is that it's probably neither of them. Most likely, your situation is it's distance learning, or they might call it remote learning, or some kind of hybrid of distance learning and in person. So why does any of this matter? It matters because the rights and protections attached to homeschooling, homebound instruction, distance learning aren't the same. And it's not the same for families. It's not the same for schools either. So, you know, homebound instruction, again, is run and supported by a public school, and it has to comply with IDEA requirements, as well as the state laws that define and govern it. Homeschooling, again, is a form of opting out of the traditional public school services, including IDEA protections and services. Distance learning is legally closest to normal, just in-person instruction. This is where the the unique uncertainties around the pandemic come in, because we've never really been in this situation before. So maybe, you know, it helps to think of it. It's important to keep the things separate, and remember that it's a matter of the enrollment. And so I will pass it over to Christa now. Christa, you're muted.
How about now? Good? Yes. Thanks for joining us, everyone, tonight. I'm Christa Stevens. I am a State Government Affairs Director, and I wanted to point out to you some of the examples that Bart was talking about when he said that homebound is defined by the states. And so here I've pulled up 3 different examples of how homebound is defined in Florida, Pennsylvania, Arizona. And the one thing to keep in mind about homebound is that homebound is not going to be the same thing, the same level of support that you would have if you were just learning at home because of the pandemic. Homebound is going to be a condensed and very streamlined basic level of support. So for some of you, you may be thinking about, well, should I just have my doctor, my child's doctor, ask for my student to be homebound? You want to carefully consider that, and I would suggest you even talk to our autism response team about some considerations regarding that, because it's not going to be an apples to apples comparison as far as what the student would get under a homebound designation and what the student would get while they were still enrolled, but yet as a remote learner. If you could go on to the next. So when you look at the 3 examples, they all have some commonalities, and it's all about either a medical or, a mental or physical illness. So it could be psychiatric, it could be, or a physical manifestation of an illness. And the other characteristic that they all deal with is that it's for a time period that is not specific. So it's not, pointed out that it's going to be 3 weeks or whatever, but it is also indefinite in a lot of instances that you may not know if you're on homebound when you're going to be able to return to your previous level of enrollment and participation. Next slide. And then if we switch gears to homeschool, that very first link there at the top is a link to an article in the New York Times that talks about how the interest in homeschooling has exploded. And the states are seeing a tremendous amount of activity in parents from families who are choosing to either explore or choosing to opt out of public education because of the change in structure for public education because of the pandemic. And some of the states are seeing very high applications and questions about how you go about homeschooling. Like Bart mentioned, homeschooling is when the parent or guardian takes primary responsibility for their child's education. So it's not there, in a lot of instances, it's going to be the family is going to choose the curriculum, the family is going to decide how to structure the lessons, they're going to decide what assessments to use. Some states, for example, Texas, has a very flexible homeschool law, and it has very little strings attached to this law. It basically says As long as you commit and you sign a form that you're removing your child from public school and you're going to be homeschooling them, you're finished with your obligation to the state. Other states have have different limitations. Some of them require a specifically approved curriculum. Some of them require the students to take, the homeschool students to take assessments or submit portfolios of their work. So if you're considering homeschool, again, you want to reach out to us or another organization that deals specifically with homeschooling so that you can understand, because like Bart said, there are no protections in a homeschool setting for under IDEA. So you have no access to any type of services from, no guaranteed access to any type of services from the state.
Okay, thank you, Christa. Such important information. And as we said, there are many families who are grappling with homeschooling and homebound instruction right now. So moving right along, let's talk about IEP meetings and evaluations. I cannot help myself. I just signed my son's IEP today, 30 pages long. There's a lot going on. It's a lot to get through. Our meeting was long. It's a very confusing time. But what's happening with that right now? Are those still taking place? So moving right ahead. Bart, please explain. You're on.
Sure. So you can probably guess what I'm going to say here. Again, Congress has not changed IDEA, so the timelines for all the different components of IDEA are still in place. Again, an IEP is an individualized education program, and so it has specific timelines of when things need to happen, and they're the same. They're the same as they were. It's still 60 days to do an initial evaluation once a parent has consented to it. It's still 30 days between that evaluation to the production of the IEP if it's assessed that the student needs one. We're still on a year at maximum between IEP meetings. We're still on three-year triennial reviews of an IEP. And this one's important. You still have the right to call for an IEP meeting. That has not changed. It's also important to know that, so again, by federal law, the timelines are the same, but that state laws can exceed federal law. They can't do less, but they can do more. So make sure to check on whether all of these timelines are exactly right for where you live. Your school should be giving you that information all on their own, but there's never any harm in asking for it, especially right now, while schools are understaffed and staff are overworked. So don't be afraid to ask for that. Next slide, please. Okay, so do IEP teams have to meet in person? And the answer to this is a hard no, they don't. IDEA permits alternative ways to hold IEP meetings. It says it right in the statute. And here's what it says. It says, when conducting IEP team meetings and placement meetings and carrying out administrative matters, such as scheduling, exchange of witness lists, and status conferences, the parent of a child with a disability and a local educational agency, that's a school district, may agree to use alternative means of meeting participation, such as video conferences and conference calls. So if it's unsafe for an IEP team to meet in person, you can use these other options. You can use video conferencing or calling services. You can do it over Zoom or Google Duo or FaceTime or Skype or two cans on a string. And this is really important. You can meet over the phone. This is really important for areas with limited broadband access or for people who don't have broadband access. You can absolutely do this over the phone. It says it right there in the statute. So the bottom, and if you need help, ask the school for technical help. The bottom line here, next bullet, please. The bottom line is that you should assume that you will participate in IEP meetings just the way you always would, and on the same schedule that you always would. Just make sure that you communicate with your school to make sure that everyone on the team knows how you're going to do it. So again, could be phone, could be Zoom, and when that meeting will take place.
Part of federal law is that every state needs to have a parent information center, parent training and information center. And some states actually have more than one. But the locale or where they're situated doesn't make a difference, because all their information is online, and they are set up with professionals to help you as a parent or caregiver navigate your way, not only during a pandemic, but also in your regular interactions with the school district and your school regarding special education services. That's their primary focus, and they can work with families one-on-one. They can coach you or walk through with you how you want to present information to the IEP meeting or your IEP team. Just a great tool for any parent to know and to utilize. They are especially equipped during this time period to help with the pandemic issues. And so, go back to that slide one more time. The link at the bottom there can help. From that one site, you can then select your state, and it'll take you directly to a list of the parent training and information centers for your state. And you can choose from the ones to get access to or to utilize. So here's one I pulled. Here's some screenshots from Vermont. Vermont has a very comprehensive website, and they have a tab right on their front page there that says COVID resources. And so these are resources that they've pulled together that are going to help you navigate, especially meetings. So I noticed that when I clicked on COVID resources, I then got taken to a page where there were a series of questions, common asked questions. And one of them was, how should I plan to participate in a virtual meeting with my child's school? And Vermont's Family Network, they put together a list of suggestions on how to do this. And then they went even further, and they provided a 6-page virtual tip sheet. And it goes over every component possible that you could think of topics that you'd want to think about before you sit down for that Zoom or that virtual meeting or that phone call. And it helps you think through the topics that you're going to have to discuss in that meeting. And one of the things that I thought was especially helpful is on the next slide. It's a chart that just helps you think through the components of the technology aspect of the meeting. Because, if you're not a professional who's dealing day in, day out with Zoom meetings, setting up these meetings and participating effectively within them can often be quite complicated. And so what they've put together here is some tips on how to make sure that you're ready to participate. Because as you know, or as you will experience, that IEP team meeting is a gathering of many, many different folks, and everybody's schedule is important. And so you want to be ready to get going and actively participate right from the get-go. And the Parent Training Center can help walk you through some of these technical components if this isn't in your skill set, because they want to make sure that you can actively participate. So I recommend that you use these parent training and information centers. They're an important resource for you as parents. The timeline that Bart mentioned for evaluations and reevaluations. As he mentioned, if you have a kiddo who is in need of being assessed, whether or not they qualify for special education, each state has some different steps, but they all pretty much follow the same federal guidelines. And you're going to see that it's a very scheduled process. So for example, I pulled Colorado's step-by-step instructions, and you'll notice that they say that even during the pandemic, there is no change to the timeline for initial evaluations. So if you've requested that you have your child evaluated, the school district has the responsibility to follow through as the federal law tells them they have to. Now, you do have the flexibility to mutually agree upon an extension of time in order to wait until there's face-to-face assessment. That's possible. But many of the components of an evaluation can take place virtually. So you don't want to put that off too long and possibly risk, having your child not have the support or services they need because you're waiting for back to face-to-face instruction. And the same thing can be said for reevaluations. There is no waiver for the reevaluations that need to occur every 3 years. Again, the parents can agree to extend that time period, and the parents can also agree to allow the educators and the service providers to use information that they've already have gathered on your child's performance as an assessment tool during the reevaluation time. So there may be some ideas that your IEP team comes up with about how to reevaluate your child in a different way than they have in the past. And you can carefully consider whether you want to use that new method or if you want to wait until there's face-to-face assessing that can go on. And then one last note here, it's about dismissals. And we would encourage anyone who's being approached by their school district about dismissing a child from special education during this time of uncertainty. We would encourage anyone who's being asked that to do a lot of homework before signing off on this dismissal. This is probably not a good time to lower the level of support that we are providing to children with special needs. So again, if you're hearing from your child's school or your IEP team that your child is ready to be dismissed from special education, consider that very carefully. And again, reach out to our autism response team and ask some questions about how that should be done or if that should be done during this time period.
Thank you so much, Christa. And I think we're going to keep hearing from you. We're going to talk about the difference between remote and virtual learning, lingo that we're hearing so much these days.
Yes, you are hearing a lot about remote and virtual learning. And remote learning, I want you to think about remote learning as being appropriate when there's an interruption during learning for a temporary period. And so we are hearing a lot about this when we hear that maybe a teacher or a student tested positive and they want the students who have had contact with that individual to stay at home for 2 weeks. So then they'll tell those families, your child then needs to shift to remote learning. And what that usually means is that your child will continue to engage in the class that they were enrolled in, the classes they were enrolled in, but they would be doing this from home through an online platform like Canvas or Google Classroom. That's what mostly we're hearing about. So again, that's an interruption to their regular face-to-face learning, and it's for a temporary period. So a lot of schools did this at the beginning of the year. They just set up the school year as a remote learning time, and now are starting to transition back to face-to-face. Now contrast that with virtual learning. Virtual learning is been around for a while, but this is the concept where you enroll in the class or the student takes the class with the full understanding that from the very beginning and all the way through the end, it's going to be an online course. And so they understand they need to have the technology, they need to have time set aside. A lot of the times it's a self-paced program or curriculum, and it really requires the student to be quite independent and to be quite self-directed with their studies. So again, that's where the whole semester or the whole year long, the student is part of a virtual learning environment, and they understand that that is the case for that entire period. Now, when we see our kiddos being switched from face-to-face instruction to remote instruction, you may wonder, well, how will that affect my child's IEP? Because after all, the IEP was prepared with the expectation that the child was going to be in a classroom in front of a teacher, with a teacher in front of them. And that is not going to be the case if they're participating in distance learning. So in general, it's up to the states to create a set of supports that will allow your child to succeed in that remote setting. And a lot of the states are using different language to characterize that temporary setup. I want to point to California's instance here, because California has formalized the process, and they said that every child who has an IEP document needs to have an amendment to that document where it explains exactly how the services and supports that the child will need are going to be provided. So they've actually codified it, it's in law, and they expect that all their students would have that in place. I haven't heard of any other states doing that, but most of them have set up the expectation that the schools will do that. And so you should be looking for a temporary document that explains how your child will continue to receive the type of supports that they have in the classroom.
Okay, thank you, Christa. Appreciate that information. And now we get to my favorite section, which I like to refer to as the "What did I miss" section. And I have to share a story. I was driving in the car the other day with my son, Jack, driving him to school. And he right now is going to in-person school 3 hours a day. And I'm so grateful. But that's not a full day. So I was thinking about what that means. And of course, I could not help but think about everyone's favorite musical, well, almost everyone's, Hamilton, and the song, which I would love to sing for you right now, called "What Did I Miss?" I will say, when I was singing it in the car from the back seat, my son on his iPad commented, "All done." So I will be all done with my "What did I miss" segue right now and turn it over to Bart, who will actually give you meaningful information about what did I miss? Compensatory services.
Okay,
Please,
compensatory.
Bart.
No, thanks. I'm good. Okay, compensatory services. So speaking from an advocate's point of view, I can tell you that if there is one topic in education during the pandemic where there just seems to be widespread confusion, and I mean that from top to bottom, from within families and for school administrators and teachers and government officials, this is the one where everyone seems to have just not really sure what's going on. And so the reason for this is similar to some of the other things that have happened tonight, where there is no federal definition for what compensatory services are. It's not defined in IDEA or anywhere else. And so I think it's best to start with a general explanation of what they are and to try and separate them out from some of the other things that people have been confusing them for. So what are they? So you might hear them also called compensatory education or comp ed sometimes. And what they are, in short, is a legal remedy that is meant to compensate a student for lost services due to the failure of the school to provide a FAPE as determined in a judicial proceeding. And that's really important. We'll get back to that in a minute. But first, the core concept of what they're supposed to do, how they're supposed to function, is to square up with a student, right? It's to compensate them for their lost time. So They're not meant to exceed what was due under FAPE or to punish a school for not doing it. It's just about trying to put the student in the position that he or she would have been in had nothing gone wrong. So students, as a general rule, are not entitled to compensatory services as a matter of course. You don't get them just because. They have to be awarded by a court. And that is important because that will determine how you get there, right? If you want to have something awarded by a court, you have to go to court to get it. The pandemic, has disrupted everybody's education, and schools across the country have been trying really hard to make things as good as they can be. The spring was really challenging for schools because they sort of overnight had to flip a switch and go from ordinary in-class services to totally virtual, and they weren't really sure how to do it. And what they were trying to do, the way that they were trying to make things better for students when they had to flip that switch, that's not compensatory services. You might hear them called recovery services or makeup services or catch-up services. That's fine, but that's not the same thing as compensatory services. And again, it matters because for compensatory services, you've got to go to court to get them, but for general recovery services, those are things that the school should be giving you as a matter of fact, if they're doing it for everybody else. Next bullet, please. This one comes up frequently in conversations about compensatory services, and it's the idea that, obviously we've been in this pandemic now for however many months, coming up on a year, believe it or not, and a lot of families have questions about or feel that their kids should be receiving services, but they're going to age out of IDEA at age 21 in most states. There is legal precedent for compensatory services to be awarded to a student after they hit 21 or whatever the age out age is in your state. It's 26 in Michigan. It's 21 in most states. But this is a thing that is not guaranteed, and so it's important that you know that it's not guaranteed. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is the deal here? Why is this so confusing for everybody? I think it largely just comes down to the labeling of it. So again, there's no federal definition here. It's not defined in statute. And so it's handled state by state. And a lot of that is because those legal proceedings, if you sue a school for denial of FAPE, that's going to be handled at the state level. And that also influences why they look different from place to place. It's because those are linked to where they are. Next bullet. So yeah, as I said, this is largely just, I think it's just largely a question of a lot of officials who aren't education professionals. And again, even teachers and school administrators who are in uncharted waters here, using terms interchangeably when they're really just not the same thing. We've even seen this from the US Department of Education. There was some guidance that they put out back in March that was talking about recovery services, but they called them compensatory services, and it created a lot of stress in the field. Next bullet. So this is what we think you should know. So the take-home message here is to be careful in how you talk about these. We want you to know, it's important for families to know that compensatory services exist and very generally how they work. You do not need to be an expert on this, and no one expects you to be. But it's important for you to know that there is a certain risk associated with the way that you talk about them. And that's just, again, because of the confusion. It's possible that you might be talking about recovery services, and you say compensatory services, and the person you're speaking with, who maybe is from the school, will think mistakenly that you're talking about suing a school to get them, and they might misinterpret your intentions. So you need to be careful about how you talk, and just make sure that you're on the same page. Our hope here is just that having this baseline knowledge will help you make sure that what you're saying is what they're hearing, because things tend to work out better for everybody if everyone's on the same page.
All right, so talking about that lingo, talking about what did I miss? That's really the question that you want to be asking. And if you want to find clarification about how these missed services are referred to in your state, go to the State Department of Education and look around. So here's an example from Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, they actually do call those missed services compensatory services, although it's not the technical legal definition that Bart was referring to. They are asking the districts to prioritize specific students that are in certain categories, students with complex and significant needs. Those are students already identified as high needs. Students who could not engage in remote learning due to their disability or lack of technology. Those are prioritized for those makeup, or what Massachusetts refers to as compensatory services. Students who primarily use augmentative and alternative communication devices. My son uses an iPad to communicate. So just a personal example there. Students who are homeless and are struggling, and students in foster or congregate care. And of course, the dual English language learners are also prioritized in Massachusetts. So additionally, when they talk about compensatory services in Massachusetts, they refer to preschool children who start into preschool in special education might have been interrupted. And we've seen that, and we've actually advocated in the states to make sure that funding that's coming down from the Autism Cares Act is utilized to help these preschool age children when they're coming out of early intervention and they're going into special education, usually at the age of 3. We want to make sure they have the time to make that transition appropriately. On the other end of special education, age 21, 22, when you're aging out, that transition period is so important. And so Massachusetts acknowledges this as a high priority group as well. Students who are turning 22 during the suspension of in-person education are prioritized for these makeup services. And so it's really important that families know that. And again, I want to mention that Autism Speaks advocacy team has advocated on the state level that funding from the CARES Act, not the Autism Cares Act, the CARES Act as part of COVID, was utilized in the school districts so that transition services could be provided for students transitioning out of special education. Anyway, and they also want the department wants the families, the IEP teams to work together, and these students are to be prioritized by December 15th of 2020. So again, that is just one example from one state, and they're calling it compensatory services, and they're prioritizing certain student populations. That's not federal law, that's just how the state is interpreting it. On the other side, we wander over to Iowa, where they really talk about the fact that compensatory services are not really what makeup services are, but rather those are recovery services. So again, just some examples about how the language can be so different. But for you as families, what I want to remind you is to just please keep a record of what your child is missing. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. It can just be a spiral notebook, a legal pad, anything, but track what they're missing. When you look at their IEP, I've got the IEP here of the guy in the background who's making noises right now. What has he missed? What has he not received during this time of limited or no access to school? Limited access to school, I should say. Has he missed occupational therapy? Has he missed other sorts of services through his IEP? Keep a record of that, take it to your IEP meeting and talk about how it could be made up. No matter what state you live in, no matter what they call it, those services, those what did I miss services are going to be so critical moving forward. So you have every right to advocate for that free and appropriate public education that should have been provided during this time. Okay, thank you for sitting through those 5 questions. We hope that they were helpful to you. And now we want to turn this over to our supports and services team to talk about actual resources for you. We've told you, hey, think about doing this, keep a record of that, don't forget about this. That's a lot to think about as a family member, especially during such a stressful, exhausting time. So let's share some resources with you to hopefully support you. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Arianna.
Thanks, Judith.
Thank
Hi,
you.
everyone. I'm Arianna Esposito, and I'm the Director of Lifespan Services at Autism Speaks. And just want to share a couple of our COVID-19 information and resources. So as you see, this is a snapshot of when you log on to the Autism Speaks onto our website, you'll see this yellow banner that pops up at the top. And if you click on that banner, it will take you to a web page that is full of incredible resources that are broken down based on, your relationship to autism, whether you're a family member, whether you're a person with autism, or you're someone who's supporting students or other individuals with autism, such as teachers, educators, and other professionals. Our information and resources on this page are constantly being updated because COVID keeps changing, and as it drags on, the needs of our community are vastly changing. So we have everything from social stories to explain what is COVID to tips on how to adjust your child's routine through either going back and forth between hybrid learning, in-person learning, or distance learning, and vice versa, and support on helping and tips for getting your child used to wearing a mask. So it's chock full of really incredible information, and it's constantly being updated. So definitely check that out. And then I also want to highlight another incredible resource. So outside of COVID, we have over 40 toolkits that live on our website. This is a snapshot of all, if not most, of our toolkits. Here they talk about a wide variety of topics, from a 100-day toolkit for your first 100 days after receiving an autism diagnosis, all the way up through blood draws on the sort of our medical side of things, and those can be accessed through our website. And now I'll pass it over to Andrew to talk about Autism Response Team.
Hi, everyone. We're really honored that you joined us tonight. And just one more time, wanted to say thanks for taking some time to spend the evening with us learning about this. We built this presentation off of needs from the community. So we love hearing from you, and we love doing what we can to support the community around the nation and internationally as well. So the Autism Response Team is a group of people with Autism Speaks that are staged around the country. We provide resources and information and ideas for anyone that reaches out to us. And, we've covered a lot of this tonight. These are a lot of the top topics that we see through ART in our response team. And just wanted you to know that that's a resource in addition to the Autism Speaks website that you can access by calling us, emailing, or doing a live chat with us. We're 9 to 5 across all time zones in the United States. And if we go to the next slide real quick, we just want to share, here's our number. So it's really 888-AUTISM-2. And we also have a Spanish line that you can reach out to. Email is help@autismspeaks.org. And again, there's all the COVID-19 resources that Arianna just described. But really, I encourage you to kind of take this presentation in and then think about any further questions you might have, and really do reach out to us at the Autism Response Team. And someone from that team will be able to provide individualized supports and ideas for you when you do reach out. And the last slide is just, again, how to reach out to us. That information is there. We look forward to hearing from you and are so honored that you joined us tonight. And can't wait to learn more from you and interact in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And thank you, Arianna. It's really important that if you need to reach out, that you do, with the chat, with the email, with the number, whatever is most convenient for you. We know that life can be stressful and busy, but please know that we're here. And not only do we want to provide resources that will support you, but it also informs us. It informs what we focus on. It informs the advocacy that we work on the state and federal level. We want it to be meaningful across the country, across the spectrum, across the lifespan. So thank you for joining us tonight. I hope you learned something. I hope it was helpful. We do have a survey that we're going to share with you, so please fill that out. We need your feedback so that we can support our community in a meaningful way. And again, the presentation is on the website. You can see it at autismspeaks.org. It also will be emailed to you along with a recording of this if you really want to watch it. And that will be emailed in the morning. So don't look for that tonight. It's going to be in the morning. So please take good care of yourselves. We will talk to you again very soon. Hang in there as you advocate for appropriate special education during such a challenging time. Take care.